Before we step into another year, before we start making promises to everybody else about who we're going to be for them, God is interrupting the noise to ask one question: where did you go? Somewhere along the way, you learned how to carry everybody else's expectations, manage their opinions, survive their disappointments, and still smile through it all. You became so skilled at being everything for everyone that you forgot how to be honest about what you need, what you feel, what you're grieving, and what you're becoming. And now 2026 is standing at the door, not asking you to do more, not demanding you prove anything, but inviting you to come back to yourself. This is not a selfish call, it's a sacred one. Because the version of you God designed cannot fully show up while you're still dragging the weight of people who were never assigned to your future. There are seasons where holding on is faith, and there are seasons where letting go is obedience. And this is a season where God is saying, focus on yourself, not in pride, but in purpose. Let them go, not in bitterness, but in freedom. Because what God is calling you into requires clarity, healing, and courage that you cannot access while you are constantly explaining yourself to people who refuse to understand you. This message is for the one who feels guilty for choosing themselves, for the one who feels anxious when they stop fixing everybody else, for the one who wonders if letting go means they failed. God is calling you back to you because you matter too. Your soul matters too. Your future matters too. And the next chapter cannot be written with the ink of old attachments. There is a quiet work God does before he ever does a public one. And that work often starts with separation. Not because everyone around you is bad, but because you've been stretched too thin, trying to be accessible to people who don't have access to your calling. God is calling you back to yourself because you have been living fragmented, giving pieces of your mind here, your emotions there, your energy everywhere, and wondering why you feel empty even when you're surrounded. You keep asking God for clarity about your future, but clarity requires stillness, and stillness requires space. You can't hear God clearly when you're constantly responding to everyone else's expectations. Somewhere along the way, you started confusing being needed with being valued. You stayed because they depended on you. You tolerated because you were familiar. You overextended because you didn't want to disappoint. And slowly, subtly, you drifted away from yourself. God is not calling you back to shame you. He's calling you back to restore you. Because the version of you that keeps sacrificing without replenishment is not sustainable, and God is too intentional to build a future on burnout. Focusing on yourself in this season is not about isolation, it's about alignment. It's about asking hard questions like, why do I feel responsible for their emotions? Why do I feel anxious when I prioritize my healing? Why do I feel guilty when I rest? Those questions are invitations. They reveal where you've been conditioned to abandon yourself to keep peace. And God is saying, I never asked you to disappear so others could feel comfortable. I never asked you to keep shrinking so relationships could survive. I never asked you to carry what I didn't assign. When God calls you back to yourself, he's calling you back to truth. The truth about what hurts you. The truth about what drained you, the truth about what season you're really in, because you cannot step into 2026 pretending you're healed when you're still bleeding internally, pretending you're whole when you're still fractured by old attachment. Letting them go begins internally before it ever becomes external. It starts when you stop rehearsing conversations you'll never have, when you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, when you stop trying to prove your worth through over-functioning. You may still see them, you may still love them, but you no longer allow them to define you. God is calling you back to you because you've outsourced your identity to environments that were only meant to be temporary. And when God says focus on yourself, he's saying tend to the wounds you ignored while surviving. Tend to the dreams you postponed while supporting everyone else's vision. Tend to the voice inside you that keeps whispering, there has to be more than this. This is the season where you learn that focusing on yourself is not neglecting God, it's honoring what he entrusted to you. Your mind is a garden, and you cannot keep letting people trample through it without intention. Your heart is sacred ground, and access should be earned, not assumed. God is calling you back to yourself because he wants you whole, not just functional, whole enough to say no without explaining, whole enough to walk away without hating, whole enough to trust that obedience will cost you some relationships, but will birth the life you prayed for. There will be people who don't understand your distance. Let them misunderstand. There will be people who call your boundaries pride. Let them talk. There will be moments where you question if you're doing the right thing because it feels unfamiliar. Growth always feels unfamiliar before it feels right. God is not punishing you by removing people. He's preparing you by lightening the load. You cannot carry old versions of yourself into a new season and expect new results. And the most loving thing you can do for yourself in 2026 is to stop negotiating your healing, to stop revisiting spaces that reopen wounds, to stop giving unlimited access to people who have shown you they cannot steward your heart. God is calling you back to you, not the you that learned to survive, but the you he originally designed. The one with joy that isn't performative. The one with peace that isn't dependent on approval. The one with confidence rooted in calling, not comparison. This is the work before the breakthrough. This is the separation before the elevation. This is the focus before the fruit. Letting go is one of the most misunderstood acts of obedience because we've been taught that if something ends, someone must be at fault. We assume that distance means disloyalty, that release equals rejection, that stepping away is the same as giving up. But God is correcting that narrative in this season. He is teaching you that letting go is not rejection, it is redirection. It is not about pushing people away in anger. It is about being pulled forward in purpose. Some connections didn't end because you failed. They ended because they fulfilled their assignment. And if you keep dragging what God already released, you will delay where he is trying to lead you. You've been grieving losses that were actually exits orchestrated by God and mourning doors that close to protect you. There are relationships, habits, environments, and even versions of yourself that were never meant to cross into 2026 with you, not because they were evil, but because they were seasonal. Redirection often feels like rejection because it bruises our ego before it builds our destiny. It hurts to realize that someone you prayed would stay was only meant to walk with you for a chapter. It stings to accept that your loyalty outgrew their capacity. It feels personal when God starts removing familiar voices, familiar patterns, familiar support systems. But God is not dismantling your life to harm you. He is rearranging it to align you. You are becoming too comfortable in spaces that no longer required faith. You are staying connected to people who knew your history but could not handle your future. And God in his mercy began to redirect you, not by explaining everything, but by shifting your appetite, your tolerance, and your discernment. There are some relationships God didn't break. He simply allowed you to see clearly. You didn't suddenly change. You simply stopped ignoring what had always been there. The lack of reciprocity, the subtle manipulation, the way you were celebrated for what you gave, but not for who you were. And once your eyes opened, you could no longer pretend that staying was an act of love. Staying would have been an act of self-betrayal. Redirection is God's way of saying, where I'm taking you, you cannot afford to be this distracted, this depleted, this divided. You don't have the emotional margin to keep managing dynamics that drain you. You don't have the spiritual capacity to keep revisiting cycles I already freed you from. Letting go doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's you no longer chasing closure. Sometimes it's you no longer explaining your boundaries. Sometimes it's you choosing peace over being understood. And that quiet release can feel like rejection to the other person, but that does not mean you rejected them. It means God redirected you, and you have to be strong enough to let people misinterpret your obedience without trying to correct their perception. Because the moment you start over-explaining your release, you step back into attachment. God is teaching you how to trust him enough to move forward without needing everyone's approval. Redirection often feels lonely because it removes what was familiar before it reveals what is next. There is a gap between what you left and what you're walking into, and that gap can feel unsettling. That's where doubt creeps in. That's where you wonder if you made the right decision. That's where the enemy tries to convince you that silence means you were wrong. But silence is often confirmation. God removes noise so you can hear him again. He removes distractions so you can see clearly again. He removes crutches so you can discover the strength you forgot you had. And if you're honest, some of the things you're holding on to are not sustaining you. They're just familiar. Redirection also exposes how deeply you've tied your identity to who stayed. You measured your worth by who needed you. You gauged your value by who depended on you. So when God redirects you, it feels like you're losing a part of yourself. But you're not losing yourself. You're recovering yourself. You're meeting the version of you that doesn't have to overextend to be loved. You're discovering the version of you that doesn't have to perform to belong. And that version of you needs space to grow. God cannot introduce you to new connections while your hands are still clenched around old ones. He cannot expand your territory while you're still guarding what he already told you to release. Letting go is not an act of bitterness, it's an act of trust. It says, God, I trust you more than I trust my comfort. I trust you more than my fear of being alone. I trust you more than my attachment to what feels safe. And that trust activates redirection. God doesn't always tell you where you're going, but he will always tell you what can't come with you. And that's where maturity is built, when you stop asking, why did they leave, and start asking, what is this making room for? When you stop replaying what you lost and start preparing for what's coming. When you stop interpreting endings as punishment and start recognizing them as preparation. There are people who will not be able to follow you into your next season because it would require them to grow in ways they are not willing to. And that is not your responsibility to fix. Redirection means you stop trying to drag people into alignment. You stop negotiating your obedience to keep connections intact. You stop shrinking your calling to preserve relationships. God is calling you higher, and not everyone wants the altitude. Some people are comfortable where the air is thin spiritually. Some people benefit from who you were, not who you're becoming. And if they cannot celebrate your growth without resenting it, God will redirect you away from them, not to punish them, but to protect you. Letting go will test your faith because it removes your sense of control. You don't get to decide how people respond to your obedience. You don't get to manage their emotions. You don't get to control their narrative. And that can feel terrifying if you're used to being the fixer, the peacemaker, the glue. But God is weaning you off that role. He is teaching you that you are not responsible for outcomes, only obedience. Redirection is not your job to justify, it's your job to follow. And as you follow, clarity will catch up. Peace will catch up. Provision will catch up. But only if you stop running back to what God already moved you away from. This season is not about proving that you didn't mean harm. It's about accepting that your healing may inconvenience people who benefited from your brokenness. And that does not make you cruel. It makes you courageous. Redirection will always offend familiarity. It will always disrupt comfort. It will always expose who is connected to you for access versus alignment. And God is saying, let them go, not because they are bad, but because where you're going requires a lighter load, a clearer focus, and a deeper trust. You are not being rejected. You are being redirected. And everything God redirects you toward is connected to who you are becoming, not who you used to be. Healing has a rhythm to it, and that rhythm is constantly disrupted when you keep going back to the place that wounded you. You keep asking God to heal what you refuse to stop touching. You keep praying for peace while reopening doors that steal it. You keep asking for clarity while walking back into confusion. And God, in his mercy, keeps reminding you that you cannot heal what you keep re-entering. Healing is not just about time, it's about distance. Distance from the trigger, distance from the cycle, distance from the version of you that learned how to survive instead of how to be whole. And this is where it gets uncomfortable because familiarity feels safer than freedom. Even when familiarity hurts, you know how to navigate the pain you recognize. You know how to manage disappointment you can predict, but healing requires you to leave what you know for what you need, and that kind of obedience feels like risk. There are wounds that didn't heal because they were never given the space to close. Every time you went back, you tore the scab off and wondered why it still hurt. Every time you re-engage, you reset the progress. Every time you entertain the hope that this time it will be different, you ignored the pattern God was trying to show you. Healing is interrupted when you confuse access with assignment. Just because someone can reach you doesn't mean they're meant to. Just because you can return doesn't mean you should. And God is saying, stop spiritualizing cycles I already told you to break. Stop asking me to heal you while you keep choosing what harms you. Re-entering is subtle. It doesn't always look like going back physically. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's mental. Sometimes it's you replaying conversations in your head, reopening wounds in your imagination, re-experiencing pain that already happened. You left the environment, but you brought it with you. You stopped talking to them, but you kept rehearsing their words. And God is saying healing requires more than relocation. It requires release. You cannot keep revisiting a place you begged me to bring you out of and expect transformation. Healing needs consistency. It needs boundaries. It needs you to honor what hurt you enough to stop exposing yourself to it. There is a part of you that goes back because it's still looking for validation from the source of the wound. You want the apology you never got. You want the change you hoped for. You want closure that only God can give. So you keep re-entering, not because it's good for you, but because you're hoping this time it will end differently. But healing doesn't come from rewriting the past. It comes from releasing it. And God is saying, I cannot heal what you keep placing back in harm's way. You keep reopening doors I closed because you're afraid that closing them permanently means you lost something. But what if closing that door is how you win your peace back? Re-entering delays healing because it keeps you emotionally attached to an outcome God never promised. You're waiting for people to become who they showed you they were not willing to be. You're holding space for potential while ignoring reality. And every time you go back, you reinforce the wound instead of the lesson. Healing begins when you accept what is, not when you fantasize about what could have been. God is trying to mature you past chasing explanations and into choosing peace. But peace will always require you to stop re-entering spaces that thrive on chaos. Some of you keep re-entering because silence scares you. When you stop engaging, you have to sit with yourself. You have to feel what you avoided. You have to acknowledge the grief, the anger, the disappointment. Re-entering becomes a distraction from doing the real work. But God is saying, if you would stay present long enough, you would see that I am already healing you in the quiet. The discomfort you feel when you stop going back is not a sign that you're doing the wrong thing. It's a sign that healing has begun. Pain surfaces before it subsides. Truth emerges before freedom settles. And the temptation to re-enter is strongest right before breakthrough. You cannot heal what you keep re-entering because re-entry tells your nervous system that the threat is still active. It tells your heart to stay guarded. It tells your mind to stay alert for disappointment. Healing requires safety. And safety requires boundaries. God is teaching you that boundaries are not punishment, they are protection. They are how you create an environment where healing can actually take root. Every time you say no to re-entry, you say yes to recovery. Every time you resist the urge to go back, you strengthen the part of you that believes you deserve better. There are seasons where God will allow you to feel the pull back, not to tempt you, but to show you how far you've come. The fact that you hesitate now is evidence of growth. The fact that it doesn't feel the same anymore is confirmation. You're not meant to re-enter because you're not the same person who left. Healing changes your tolerance. Healing sharpens your discernment. Healing makes old spaces feel too small, too loud, too heavy. And instead of seeing that as loss, God wants you to see it as progress. Re-entering also delays healing because it blurs accountability. You start questioning yourself instead of the pattern. You start blaming your sensitivity instead of their behavior. You start wondering if you're asking for too much when all you asked for was consistency, respect, honesty. God is saying, stop gaslighting yourself to stay connected. Stop minimizing your pain to preserve access. Healing requires honesty, and honesty sometimes means admitting that going back is harming you, even if it comforts you temporarily. This is the season where God is teaching you to trust the work He is doing beneath the surface. Healing is not always loud. Sometimes it's you choosing not to respond. Sometimes it's you resisting the urge to explain. Sometimes it's you sitting with discomfort instead of escaping it. And those quiet choices are rewiring you. They are teaching your soul that it no longer has to chase what hurts it. They are showing you that you can survive without re-entering, that you can breathe without them, that you can live without reopening that door. God is not withholding healing from you. He is waiting for you to stop interrupting it. You keep asking Him to restore what you keep tearing down. And He is saying, let me finish what I started. Stay out of what I pulled you from. Trust that distance is not denial, it's design. Healing needs room. Healing needs patience. Healing needs your cooperation. And your cooperation looks like choosing not to re-enter spaces that God has clearly marked as unsafe for your growth. Focus is one of the most underestimated expressions of faith because it doesn't always look spiritual. It doesn't shout. It doesn't impress people. It often looks like restraint, like saying no, like staying in your lane when you're capable of doing more. But focus is faith because it declares, God, I trust you enough to stop chasing everything at once. I trust you enough to believe that what is meant for me will not require me to be everywhere, explain everything, or prove myself to everyone. Focus is choosing alignment over approval. It is deciding that distraction will no longer have access to your destiny. And in this season, God is teaching you that your ability to focus is directly connected to your ability to trust Him. Distraction is subtle. It rarely shows up as something obviously wrong. Most distractions look like opportunities. They look like invitations. They look like urgent needs that are not yours to carry. And because you are capable, because you are compassionate, because you are gifted, you have a habit of saying yes before you ask God. You assume that if you can do it, you should. But just because you can does not mean you are called to. Focus requires discernment. It requires you to slow down long enough to ask, is this assignment or is this a distraction? And faith is trusting that God's no is just as powerful as His yes. You have been scattered, not because you lack discipline, but because you lack permission to prioritize. You were taught that being available meant being valuable. You were praised for being flexible, adaptable, always there. But focus is God giving you permission to tend to what He planted in you first. Faith says, I don't have to rush into every need to feel important. I don't have to respond to every crisis to feel useful. I don't have to stay busy to feel secure. Focus is resting in the belief that God is working even when you are still. Faith is required to focus because focus demands sacrifice. You have to let some things fall. You have to disappoint some people. You have to resist the urge to explain your choices. And that can feel terrifying when your identity has been tied to performance. But God is breaking that dependency. He is teaching you that your worth is not measured by how much you do, but by how well you obey. Focus narrows your vision so you can see what actually matters. It quiets the noise so you can hear God's instructions clearly. And clarity is a byproduct of trust. There is a reason God keeps pulling your attention back to the same thing, the same dream, the same area of healing, the same assignment you keep postponing because it feels inconvenient or intimidating. Focus is faith because it requires you to believe that this one thing done well is better than 10 things done halfway. You've been spreading yourself thin and calling it productivity, but God is calling it distraction. He is not impressed by your busyness. He is invested in your obedience. And obedience often requires you to do less, not more. Focus also exposes fear. You avoid focusing because focus removes excuses. When you narrow your attention, you can no longer blame lack of time, lack of resources, or lack of clarity. You have to face the real reason you've been distracted, the fear of failing if you try, the fear of succeeding and being seen, the fear of committing to something that will require consistency. Focus is faith because it says, God, I am willing to be uncomfortable if it means being alive. I am willing to commit even if I don't feel ready. I am willing to trust you with the outcome. God is calling you to focus because where you are going requires depth, not just enthusiasm. Surface level engagement will not sustain what He is building in you. You cannot keep skimming the surface of your calling and expect fruit. Focus is how roots grow deep. Focus is how stamina is built. Focus is how you learn to stay when it stops feeling exciting. And that staying is an act of faith. It says, I believe you are in this. Even when it feels slow, even when it feels lonely, even when there is no immediate affirmation. Patience keeps you reacting. Focus allows you to respond. When you are distracted, everything feels urgent. Every message demands immediate attention. Every opinion carries weight. But when you are focused, you move with intention. You are no longer pulled by every emotion or expectation. You become anchored. And anchoring yourself requires faith because it means you are choosing stability over stimulation. God is teaching you that not everything that grabs your attention deserves your energy. Focus also protects you from comparison. When you are scattered, you are constantly looking sideways, measuring your progress against others, wondering if you are behind. But when you are focused, you are looking forward. You are committed to your pace, your process, your path. And that commitment is faith. It says, I trust that God's timing for me is not late. I trust that my journey does not have to look like anyone else's to be valid. Focus frees you from the pressure to compete. There's a discipline to focus that feels like loss before it feels like gain. You mourn the options you didn't choose. You grieve the versions of yourself that could have been. But faith allows you to believe that what you chose is enough, that obedience will be rewarded, even if it is not immediately recognized. God is not asking you to do everything. He is asking you to do what He assigned you and to do it with excellence. Focus is how you honor that assignment. In this season, focus will feel like resistance. You will have to resist distraction, resist guilt, resist the urge to multitask your calling. But every time you choose focus, you are choosing faith. You are declaring that God's plan does not require you to be frantic, that his will does not demand burnout, that his promises are not fragile. Focus is your way of saying, God, I trust you enough to slow down, narrow in, and stay committed to what you placed in my hand. Obedience is often celebrated when it looks bold and public, but some of the most transformative obedience you will ever practice happens quietly, behind the scenes, when you decide to draw a line where there used to be none. Obedience sometimes looks like boundaries, and that truth challenges everything you were taught about love, loyalty, and sacrifice. You were conditioned to believe that saying yes was holy, that endurance was proof of faith, that tolerating discomfort was the price of being good. But God is correcting that misunderstanding. He is showing you that boundaries are not rebellion against love. They are alignment with truth. And in this season, obedience is not about how much you can carry. It's about what you are finally willing to lay down. Boundaries feel disobedient at first because they confront your fear of disappointing people. You worry that if you say no, you'll be misunderstood, that if you step back, you'll be labeled selfish, that if you protect your peace, you'll lose connection. But obedience to God will always require you to release the need to manage how people perceive you. You cannot be fully obedient and fully approved at the same time. There will be moments where honoring God means disappointing others, and that tension is where growth happens. Boundaries are not about controlling people, they are about stewarding yourself. God never asked you to give unlimited access to everyone. He asked you to love wisely. He asked you to walk in discernment, and discernment creates boundaries. Even Jesus withdrew. Even Jesus said no. Even Jesus honored limits, not because he lacked compassion, but because he understood assignment. When you ignore boundaries, you don't become more loving, you become more depleted. And depletion does not glorify God. Obedience sometimes looks like acknowledging that you are human, that you have limits, and that respecting those limits is an act of worship. Boundaries expose unhealthy dynamics because they interrupt patterns that benefited others at your expense. When you start saying no, when you stop over-explaining, when you refuse to engage in cycles that drain you, people who relied on your lack of boundaries will resist. They may accuse you of changing. They may question your motives. They may test your resolve. But that resistance is not a sign that you are wrong. It is a sign that the boundary is necessary. Obedience is not proven by how comfortable others feel. It is proven by how aligned you are with God's instructions. There are boundaries God has been prompting you to set, not to isolate you, but to protect the work he is doing in you. Boundaries around your time because exhaustion has made it hard for you to hear him. Boundaries around your emotions because you've been carrying feelings that were never yours to process. Boundaries around your access because not everyone deserves intimacy with you. Obedience looks like honoring those prompts instead of dismissing them out of fear. Every time you ignore a boundary God revealed, you delay the peace he intended to give you. Setting boundaries requires faith because you don't immediately see the outcome. You have to trust that God will fill the space you create. You have to believe that what you lose in people pleasing, you will gain in clarity. You have to accept that some connections will not survive your healing, and that grief is real. But obedience does not promise comfort. It promises alignment. Boundaries are how you remain aligned when everything in you wants to revert to old patterns for the sake of familiarity. Boundaries also teach you how to take responsibility for your own well-being. You stop waiting for others to change. You stop hoping someone will finally treat you differently. You stop placing your peace in someone else's hands. Obedience sometimes looks like realizing that God already gave you the authority to protect what he placed inside you. You are not powerless. You are not obligated to endure what God never assigned. Boundaries. Are you stepping into that authority with humility and confidence? There will be moments when boundaries feel lonely, when you miss the connection you had, even if it was unhealthy, when you question if you were too harsh or too quick to step back. But loneliness does not mean disobedience. Sometimes it is the space where God reintroduces you to himself. Sometimes it is the quiet where your identity is rebuilt without the noise of other people's expectations. Obedience often leads you through solitude before it leads you into community. Boundaries do not mean you stop loving. They mean you start loving from a place of wholeness. They allow you to show up without resentment. They prevent burnout from masquerading as faithfulness. They keep you from giving what you no longer have. And God is more honored by your honesty than by your overextension. He is not asking you to destroy relationships. He is asking you to redefine them in a way that reflects truth, health, and mutual respect. In this season, obedience will look quieter than you expected. It will look like unanswered messages, like leaving earlier than usual, like declining invitations without guilt, like choosing rest without apology. And every one of those choices is a declaration that you trust God enough to believe that your obedience does not require self-abandonment. Boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are doors that teach others how to enter your life correctly. And as you honor those boundaries, you will discover that obedience does not drain you, it sustains you.